The morning light filters through the carved wooden lattice of a window in Chang'an's imperial quarter, casting geometric shadows across polished jade stones arranged on a low table. The merchant's fingers move slowly among the green and white pieces, each one catching the early sunlight like captured water. But his attention isn't on their quality or their price. His eyes keep returning to the sealed scroll that arrived before dawn, its imperial red wax still warm to the touch. I am your DrowZy historian, and tonight we follow a caravan that should never have existed, carrying cargo that history barely remembers, across a desert that swallowed secrets as readily as it claimed lives. The jade merchant, whose name the records give only as Master Wei, had built his reputation on discretion. Wealthy families trusted him to acquire pieces for their private collections without drawing attention from rivals or tax collectors. Imperial officials knew he could move valuable goods without creating the kind of spectacle that attracted bandits. This morning's commission, however, requested something entirely different. The scroll contained what appeared to be a routine trade order. 50 jin of white jade from the Khotan mines, to be delivered to a buyer in Kasha before the autumn winds began. The calligraphy looked standard, the measurements precise, the payment generous but not suspiciously so. Yet something in the weight of the paper, the particular shade of the ink, the way certain characters had been formed, told Wei this was no ordinary merchant transaction. He had learned to read these subtle signs during his 20 years of moving goods between the capital and the Western territories. Sometimes a request for fine white jade actually meant information about tribal movements beyond the Pamas. An order for carved animals might indicate a need for maps showing water sources along forgotten routes. The imperial administration had discovered that genuine merchants made the most effective messengers, their presence expected and unremarkable in markets from Dunhuang to Samarkand. The morning grew warmer as Wei studied the scroll again. The delivery location had been specified with unusual precision, not just Kasha but a particular caravanserai on the southern approach to the city. The timing too seemed carefully chosen, arriving during the brief window when the desert crossing would be possible but the regular trade route still dangerous from early winter storms in the mountain passes. Wei rolled the scroll carefully and placed it in a silk pouch. Whatever this commission truly involved, it would require more than his usual network of drivers and guards. He would need people who could keep secrets, who understood that some cargoes were more valuable than gold, and who wouldn't ask too many questions about why they were being paid twice the usual rate for what appeared to be a routine journey. The jade merchant's house occupied a narrow lot in the quarter where successful traders maintained their city residences. Unlike the sprawling compounds of court officials or military commanders, these homes focused on security rather than display. Wei's storage rooms lay deep underground, accessible only through passages that twisted and doubled back on themselves. His most valuable pieces never saw daylight until they reached their final destinations. That afternoon, as the shadows lengthened across his courtyard, Wei began making the careful inquiries that would assemble his team. He sent a servant to find Chen the camel driver, whose knowledge of desert routes extended to paths that appeared on no official maps. Another message went to the widow Liu, who supplied guards for caravans and had never asked awkward questions about why some of her men carried weapons that seemed too fine for their apparent station. By evening, Wei had received the responses he expected. Chen could provide animals and drivers for a journey to Kasha, departing within the week. Liu had 6 men available, all experienced in desert travel and all carrying the kind of scars that suggested their experience had been hard-earned. The total cost would be substantial, but the payment authorization in the sealed scroll covered expenses that went far beyond moving 50 jin of jade. The Western territories had been under Han control for nearly a century, but control in such distant lands required more than military garrisons and appointed governors. The Protectorate of the Western Regions maintained its authority through an intricate network of informants, sympathetic merchants, and carefully placed officials who could monitor the constant shifts in tribal alliances and trade relationships that shaped politics beyond the Jade Gate. In the headquarters compound at Wuwei, dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through high windows as clerks copied reports from across the Western Territories onto silk scrolls. The information arrived through channels that varied from official courier routes to whispered conversations in marketplace tea houses. A tribal chief's son had been seen meeting with Parthian traders. A new oasis settlement was growing along a route that bypassed traditional checkpoints. Strange weapons had appeared in markets where local smiths lacked the skills to forge such pieces. The Protectorate's administrators had learned that the most valuable intelligence often traveled disguised as gossip, complaint, or commercial correspondence. A merchant's letter describing poor quality goods from a particular supplier might actually report that a local governor was skimming tribute payments. Complaints about bandit activity could indicate that someone was organizing resistance to Han authority. Even genuine trade disputes sometimes revealed information about resource discoveries or political changes that could affect imperial interests. Colonel Zhong, the deputy administrator for intelligence coordination, spent his afternoons reviewing these reports and deciding which deserved immediate attention from Chang'an. The morning's dispatches had included several items that, taken together, suggested something significant was happening in the regions beyond Kasha. Kushan traders were asking unusual questions about Han military strength. Local rulers who had been reliable allies were suddenly reluctant to provide the tribute and cooperation their agreements required. Most concerning, several trusted informants had simply stopped sending reports. Zhong understood that intelligence networks required constant maintenance. Informants died, were discovered, or simply decided the risks had become too great. New sources had to be cultivated, existing relationships strengthened, and occasionally entire operations restructured when circumstances changed. The reports from the far Western Territories suggested that such a restructuring might be necessary, but first they needed to understand what had compromised their existing networks. The colonel selected 3 reports for immediate forwarding to Chang'an, along with his recommendation for enhanced intelligence gathering in the affected regions. By the time his clerk finished preparing the dispatch, the afternoon shadows had grown long enough to reach across his desk. Somewhere in the capital, officials would read his assessment and decide whether the situation warranted the risks and expenses of a special mission. The answer to that question was already making its way west in the form of sealed orders to jade merchants and carefully worded instructions to caravan organizers. The imperial administration had decided that some intelligence was worth the considerable dangers of acquiring it through unconventional means. In Dunhuang, where the great trade routes divided and merchants made final preparations before attempting the desert crossings, the evening markets hummed with the particular energy that preceded departures into the unknown. Camel drivers examined their animals with the thoroughness of men whose lives depended on their beasts' endurance. Merchants weighed the value of every item they planned to carry against the weight their animals could bear across waterless distances. Master Wei arrived in Dunhuang 3 days after leaving Chang'an, his jade secured in specially padded containers that would protect the stones from the jolting of desert travel. To any observer, he appeared to be conducting exactly the kind of business that had built his reputation. He examined camels with the eye of someone who understood the difference between an animal that looked healthy and one that could survive a month in the desert. He negotiated prices for supplies with the careful attention of a merchant protecting his profit margins. But Wei was also watching for the other members of his caravan, the people whose names had been provided through channels that had nothing to do with the jade trade. The guard captain Liu had recommended turned out to be a weathered man named Jiao, whose Sogdian features and fluent Chinese suggested a background that bridged the cultural divisions of the Silk Road. The additional merchants who would provide cover for the mission arrived separately, each bringing legitimate goods and genuine trading credentials that would survive any inspection. Among them was a silk dealer whose bolts of fabric concealed compartments that could hold documents, a spice merchant whose sealed containers could carry more than cardamom and cinnamon, and a dealer in metalwork whose pieces included items that served purposes beyond decoration. To customs officials and curious travelers, they would appear to be exactly what they claimed to be. Only Wei knew that each had been selected for skills that extended beyond their commercial specialties. The assembly of the caravan took 2 days, long enough to seem natural but not so long as to attract attention from the wrong observers. Dunhuang hosted dozens of such groups every month during the traveling season, and the local officials had developed efficient procedures for inspecting goods, collecting taxes, and issuing the permits required for desert crossings. Wei's group passed through these formalities without incident, their documentation complete and their stated destinations reasonable for the time of year. On their final evening in the oasis, as the caravan members made last preparations for departure, Wei gathered his team around a small fire at the edge of their camp. The conversation that followed sounded like the usual discussion of routes and schedules, but the information being shared went considerably deeper than normal travel planning. Gao spread a cloth on the ground and used stones to mark the locations of known water sources along their intended route. But he also indicated places where emergency supplies had been cached, and alternative paths that could be used if they encountered unexpected difficulties. The silk dealer mentioned customers in various towns, but his descriptions included details about local political situations and the reliability of different officials. Each member of the group contributed information that painted a picture of the Western Territories that was far more complex and dangerous than any official map would suggest. As the fire burned lower, Wei produced the water skins that would carry their most precious cargo across the desert. To anyone watching, he was simply demonstrating the quality of the leather and the reliability of the seals. But his fingers traced patterns in the seams that had nothing to do with craftsmanship and everything to do with the messages that had been sewn into the very fabric of their containers. The technique was ancient, developed by nomadic peoples who had learned to hide information in the everyday objects that traveled with them across vast distances. A particular pattern of stitching could indicate numbers. The placement of repair patches could spell out names or locations. Even the choice of thread color carried meaning to those who knew how to read such signs. Wei's water skins contained enough encoded information to reconstruct the intelligence network that had been compromised in the far Western Territories, along with instructions for establishing new contacts and procedures for reporting back to the Protectorate. The weight of this responsibility settled over the camp like the desert cold that followed sunset. Each member of the caravan understood that they were carrying more than trade goods across the Taklamakan. They were transporting the means for the Han Empire to maintain its influence in regions where that influence was increasingly challenged, and where the consequences of losing control could reshape the balance of power across Central Asia. The moon rose full and bright over the dunes that stretched endlessly westward from Dunhuang's green fields. In its silver light, the Taklamakan desert looked deceptively peaceful, its sand dunes flowing like frozen waves toward horizons that seemed impossibly distant. But Wei and his companions knew the reputation of the place the locals called the Sea of Death, where entire caravans had vanished without leaving so much as a camel bone to mark their passage. The safer route to Kasha followed the northern edge of the desert, staying close to the mountains where streams provided reliable water and established oases offered shelter and supplies. But that route also meant passing through territories where the caravan would be observed, questioned, and possibly searched by officials whose loyalties might not align with Han interests. The intelligence they carried was too sensitive to risk exposure through routine inspections or casual encounters with the wrong people. The southern route across the heart of the desert offered anonymity at the cost of extreme danger. Travelers who attempted the crossing had to carry everything they needed to survive for weeks without resupply, navigate by stars across landscapes that shifted with every windstorm, and hope that the water sources marked on their maps hadn't been buried by sand or fouled by animals. Many who entered the Taklamakan were never seen again, their disappearances attributed to the desert's well-documented ability to swallow travelers without trace. Wei's caravan began moving before dawn, their camels loaded with supplies calculated to sustain them through a journey that would test the limits of both human and animal endurance. The animals stepped carefully in the pre-dawn darkness, their soft footfalls muffled by sand that already showed the temperature extremes they would face in the coming days. Behind them, the lights of Dunhuang grew smaller and fainter until they disappeared entirely, leaving the caravan alone with the stars and the vast silence of the desert night. The decision to travel during the cooler hours of darkness would add its own challenges to an already dangerous journey. Navigation became more difficult when landmarks were invisible, and the risk of losing the path increased dramatically when drivers had to rely on compass readings and star positions rather than visual reference points. But the alternative, traveling during the day when temperatures could kill a man in hours and when their dust trail would be visible to observers many miles away, posed even greater threats to their mission success. As the eastern horizon began to show the first pale hints of dawn, Wei looked back once toward the direction of Dunhuang and the empire that had sent them into this wasteland. Ahead lay weeks of travel through one of the world's most hostile environments, carrying secrets that could determine the fate of Chinese influence across Central Asia. The water skins that bounced gently against his camel's sides held more than liquid. They contained the encoded intelligence that would either restore the empire's networks in the Western territories or die with them in the shifting sands of the Taklamakan. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns older than any dynasty, their light casting faint shadows across the dunes as the caravan pressed deeper into the Taklamakan's heart. 47 days into their journey, the guides had begun consulting celestial maps that existed nowhere on silk or bamboo, but lived instead in the memories of men whose fathers and grandfathers had traced these same routes when the Han armies first pushed westward into territories that barely had names. Old Chen, the expedition's chief navigator, dismounted near a cluster of weathered rocks and tilted his head skyward. His weathered fingers traced invisible lines between the constellations, connecting the 7 stars of the northern Dipper to the constellation the Chinese called the Azure Dragon of the East. The mathematics of celestial navigation required no instruments more sophisticated than practiced eyes and generations of accumulated knowledge passed down through whispered lessons around desert campfires. "The Weaver Girl points true north tonight," Chen murmured to his assistant, a young man named Dao whose family had guided caravans for 6 generations. "But see how the cowherd has shifted since we left the last oasis. We've drifted 3 li south of our intended path." The correction seemed impossibly precise for men standing on trackless sand under a dome of stars, yet these desert guides possessed an almost supernatural ability to read their position from celestial movements. They understood that the star called Polaris, which the Chinese knew as the purple forbidden enclosure, remained fixed while all others rotated around it in predictable patterns. By measuring the angles between certain stars and the horizon, and factoring in the time of night and season, they could determine their location within the vast desert to an accuracy that would have impressed the court astronomers in Chang'an. But the techniques went beyond simple star charts. The guides read the desert wind patterns, noting how certain breezes carried the scent of distant water sources or the mineral tang of salt flats that lay days away. They observed how sand grains caught and reflected starlight differently depending on the underlying geology, creating subtle variations in the ground's appearance that revealed the presence of buried rock formations or underground water channels. Wei watched Chen work, fascinated by the intersection of ancient knowledge and immediate necessity. The spy network's success depended entirely on these men's ability to navigate terrain that had swallowed entire armies, yet their methods remained largely mysterious even to those who benefited from them. The guides shared their knowledge reluctantly, teaching only enough to ensure the mission's success while protecting secrets that represented their family's most valuable inheritance. As the night wore on, the caravan adjusted course according to Chen's calculations, the camels' bells creating a soft percussion that seemed to harmonize with the desert's profound silence. The stars that had guided Chinese explorers across this wasteland for centuries continued their eternal dance overhead, indifferent to the human dramas playing out in the darkness below. 3 nights later, as dawn approached and the caravan prepared to make camp for the day's rest, Dao began probing the sand near a stand of scrubby tamarisk bushes with a long wooden rod. The vegetation looked unremarkable, no different from dozens of similar patches they had passed, but something in its arrangement had caught the guide's attention. After several minutes of careful exploration, his probe struck something solid buried roughly 2 feet beneath the surface. The excavation revealed a carefully constructed cache that spoke to planning far more sophisticated than Wei had imagined possible. Wrapped in multiple layers of oiled leather and sealed clay containers, the buried supplies included not just water jars and dried provisions, but detailed intelligence reports, updated route maps, and fresh seal stamps bearing the marks of Han officials who had passed this way months earlier. The water containers bore makers' marks from workshops in Kasha and Yarkand, indicating that this supply network extended far beyond Chinese-controlled territory into regions nominally under Xiongnu influence. Someone had established and maintained these hidden depots along routes that crossed political boundaries, creating an infrastructure that suggested intelligence operations of remarkable scope and ambition. Wei examined the sealed documents while his men refilled their water skins from the buried jars. The reports contained detailed observations of Xiongnu troop movements, descriptions of fortified positions, and assessments of local rulers' loyalties written in the careful bureaucratic language of professional intelligence officers. But more intriguingly, they also included notes about other Chinese missions, suggesting that multiple spy caravans were operating simultaneously across different routes through the Western territories. The sophistication of the cache system raised questions about how long these operations had been running and who possessed the authority to coordinate such extensive preparations. The buried supplies represented significant financial investment and logistical complexity, requiring advanced teams to transport materials, construct hiding places, and establish maintenance schedules that ensured the caches remained viable for months or even years. The documents revealed that this particular depot had been refreshed just 6 weeks earlier by agents traveling westward toward Fergana. Their reports mentioned increasing Xiongnu patrols along the northern routes and recommended that future missions consider alternative paths through the southern desert approaches to avoid detection. The intelligence was current enough to be immediately useful, yet its presence here indicated communication networks that operated independently of the official diplomatic channels. As the sun climbed higher and the temperature began its daily ascent toward levels that would make travel impossible, the caravan established their day camp in the shelter of a rocky outcrop. While the men and animals rested, Wei found himself studying the bamboo message slips that had been part of the cached supplies, marveling at the intricate systems that made such far-flung operations possible. The bamboo strips themselves were works of careful craftsmanship, cut to precise dimensions and treated with lacquer that protected them from moisture and insects. Each slip contained space for exactly 47 characters, a standardization that suggested mass production and systematic distribution across the intelligence network. The writing implements included specially prepared ink sticks and brushes designed for field use, their components selected for durability under harsh desert conditions. But the real sophistication lay in the encoding systems. The messages used multiple layers of concealment, beginning with a merchant cipher that disguised intelligence reports as routine commercial correspondence about silk prices and caravan schedules. Beneath this surface layer, a secondary code embedded additional information in the spacing between characters and the selection of specific synonyms, creating documents that appeared innocuous even to readers who penetrated the initial cipher. The wax seals provided another layer of security, their designs incorporating minute details that would be nearly impossible to replicate without access to the original stamps. The seal impressions included not just official marks but tiny symbols that indicated the document's priority level, intended recipient, and authentication codes that allowed field agents to verify the intelligence's authenticity. Wei discovered that some message slips contained hollow compartments sealed with rice paste, inside which were hidden even more sensitive materials written on silk threads thin enough to be nearly invisible. These microdocuments contained the most critical intelligence, including detailed maps of Xiongnu strongholds and lists of potential collaborators among the Western Kingdom's nobility. The system's complexity reflected centuries of refinement, building on techniques that had evolved through generations of intelligence work along the Silk Road. Each element served multiple purposes, creating redundancy that ensured critical information could survive the loss of individual agents or the compromise of specific communication channels. As afternoon heat made the air shimmer above the dunes, Wei contemplated the implications of what they had discovered. The spy network's infrastructure extended far beyond what he had understood when the mission began, suggesting operations that had been running for years and involved hundreds of participants across thousands of miles of hostile territory. The buried cache represented just one node in a system that connected Chinese intelligence operations from the Jade Gate to the shores of the Caspian Sea. 2 days later, as evening shadows began to lengthen across the desert floor, the caravan approached what appeared to be another unremarkable cluster of rocks and sparse vegetation. But Chen's careful observations had identified this location as something far more significant, a hidden relay station that served as a crucial link in the intelligence network's communication chain. The station occupied a natural depression surrounded by low hills that concealed it from casual observation while providing excellent sight lines in all directions. Fresh horse droppings and the remains of recent campfires indicated regular use, though the site appeared deserted when the caravan arrived. Hidden among the rocks, however, were stone-lined pits that contained feed, water, and equipment for maintaining a small herd of relay horses. The horses themselves emerged from a concealed canyon as the sun set, led by a weathered horseman who had been watching the caravan's approach for hours. His appearance seemed to materialize from the landscape itself, so perfectly did his desert-colored robes and sun-darkened skin blend with the surrounding terrain. He greeted Chen with the casual familiarity of men who had worked together for years, though Wei had never seen him before and would learn nothing of his background during their brief encounter. The relay station operated on principles of speed and secrecy that made even urgent diplomatic missions seem leisurely by comparison. The fresh horses were bred specifically for desert travel, their bloodlines carefully maintained to produce animals capable of covering vast distances across sand and stone with minimal water and forage. Their saddles and bridles were crafted from materials that could withstand the desert's extremes while remaining light enough not to burden the animals during long-distance rides. The horsemen carried sealed message tubes containing intelligence reports from agents operating throughout the Western territories. His most recent journey had taken him to Kucha and back, a round trip of nearly 800 miles completed in just 12 days. The information he brought included urgent warnings about Xiongnu preparations for a major offensive and detailed assessments of which local rulers might be persuaded to maintain neutrality in the coming conflict. But the relay system's true sophistication became apparent as Wei observed the careful protocols surrounding message handling and route planning. Each rider carried multiple sets of documents, some genuine and others deliberately falsified, distributed among various hiding places on his person and equipment. If captured, he could surrender certain materials while protecting the most sensitive intelligence, buying time for other agents to adjust their operations accordingly. The routes themselves changed constantly, following patterns designed to confuse potential interceptors while maintaining reliable communication schedules. The horseman's next destination would be determined by coded instructions contained in the messages he carried, creating a dynamic network that could adapt to changing threats without requiring centralized coordination. As the caravan prepared to resume its westward journey, Wei reflected on the remarkable infrastructure that made their mission possible. The relay stations represented investment in intelligence capabilities that extended far beyond immediate military needs, suggesting long-term strategic thinking that planned for sustained operations across Central Asia regardless of shifting political circumstances. The following evening found the caravan positioned on a rocky outcrop that provided an excellent vantage point over one of the major trade routes crossing the Taklamakan southern edge. From their concealed position, they could observe the movement of other travelers without revealing their own presence, a capability that proved immediately valuable as several groups passed below during the night hours. The first travelers appeared shortly after midnight, a small caravan moving eastward with the careful pace of merchants who valued their cargo's safety over speed of delivery. Their camels carried the distinctive bells and decorative harnesses favored by Sogdian traders, and their route suggested they were bound for the markets of Dunhuang with goods from the Western kingdoms. But something in their formation and the way their guards maintained watch patterns suggested they might be carrying more than commercial merchandise. Wei studied their movement through a bronze mirror polished to serve as a crude telescope, noting details that might prove significant when compared with intelligence from other sources. The number of guards seemed excessive for a purely commercial venture, and their weapons included cavalry sabers of a type favored by Xiongnu warriors rather than the conventional arms typically carried by caravan escorts. More intriguingly, the caravan made a brief stop at a location that appeared to offer no obvious advantages for rest or resupply. The halt lasted just long enough for one rider to dismount, examine something on the ground, and remount before the group continued its eastward journey. The behavior suggested they were checking a predetermined marker or signal, possibly part of a communication system similar to the one Wei's own mission employed. The second group appeared near dawn, traveling westward with the urgency of messengers carrying important dispatches. Their horses were lathered with sweat despite the cool night air, indicating they had been riding hard for many hours. The riders wore the felt caps and leather armor favored by Xiongnu cavalry, and their direct route toward the western oasis suggested they were carrying intelligence about Chinese activities back to their commanders. The timing of their passage, so soon after the eastbound caravan, raised questions about whether the two groups were coordinating their movements or simply coincidentally using the same route. The possibility that they had exchanged information during a brief encounter somewhere to the west could not be dismissed, making their observations potentially valuable for understanding Xiongnu intelligence operations. As the sun rose and the temperature began its daily climb, Wei's caravan settled into concealment among the rocks to wait out the day's heat. But the night's observations had revealed that they were far from alone in the desert, and that multiple intelligence networks were operating simultaneously across the same routes they traveled. The Taklamakan might appear empty and lifeless to casual observers, but it actually teemed with hidden activity as various powers maneuvered for advantage across Central Asia's crucial trade corridors. The realization that other groups were watching and being watched in turn added new layers of complexity to their mission. Every decision about route and timing now had to account for the possibility of observation by hostile intelligence services, while also considering how their own movements might reveal information about Chinese capabilities and intentions. In the vast emptiness of the Taklamakan desert, the ancient game of espionage continued with stakes that could determine the balance of power across half the known world. The Caravan scouts had noticed the glint first, not the reflection of water that every desert traveler hopes for, but something harder, more angular, catching the moonlight from within the rocky outcroppings ahead. As they approached what appeared to be an abandoned mining site, the true nature of their discovery became clear. Scattered across the desert floor lay fragments of turquoise, some still embedded in a pale limestone matrix, others worked free by centuries of wind and the occasional flash flood that carved through these forgotten valleys. The intelligence value of mineral resources had driven empires to extraordinary lengths throughout history. These turquoise deposits, while modest compared to the great mines of Nishapur or the legendary sources in the American Southwest, represented something more valuable than their weight in precious stones. They were strategic assets, sources of wealth that could fund armies, influence trade negotiations, and shift the balance of power between distant kingdoms. The Chinese agents moved carefully through the site, documenting not just the quality and quantity of accessible turquoise, but the infrastructure that would be required to extract it efficiently. Ancient mining operations left subtle signatures that trained observers could read like text. The positioning of waste piles indicated prevailing wind patterns that miners had learned to work with rather than against. Tool marks on exposed rock faces revealed techniques that suggested contact with mining traditions from far beyond the Taklamakan. Most telling were the carefully constructed stone platforms that had once supported wooden frameworks for lifting heavy loads from excavated shafts. The engineering required for such operations implied organized labor, sustained investment, and most importantly, security arrangements that could protect valuable operations in a region where raiders moved like shadows between the dunes. The lead agent crouched beside a partially collapsed shaft entrance, running his fingers along chisel marks that remained sharp despite decades of sandblasting winds. The precision of the cuts suggested tools of exceptional quality, likely imported from workshops in Damascus or perhaps even further west. Such tools represented significant capital investment, the kind that required backing from merchants wealthy enough to fund speculative ventures in remote locations. This was intelligence worth gathering, not just the location of mineral wealth, but evidence of the trade networks and financial arrangements that made extraction profitable. What made these mineral resources worth such dangerous intelligence gathering extended beyond their immediate value. Turquoise had become a diplomatic currency in its own right, prized by courts from Constantinople to Beijing not merely for its beauty but for its rarity and the difficulty of acquiring authentic specimens. A reliable source of high-quality turquoise could provide Chinese negotiators with significant advantages in treaty discussions, particularly with Central Asian rulers who valued such stones above gold. The strategic implications rippled outward from this moonlit mining site to throne rooms thousands of miles away. The night's work revealed more than geological surveys. Hidden beneath loose stones, the agents discovered ceramic fragments that bore the marks of kilns from at least 3 different regions, evidence that this site had attracted attention from multiple intelligence services over the years. Each pottery shard told part of a larger story about who had been watching this location, when they had visited, and what they had learned. The careful placement of these fragments, protected from the worst effects of wind erosion, suggested that someone had been using them as a kind of archaeological message system, leaving markers for future agents to discover and interpret. As the false dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, the caravan prepared to move deeper into the desert valley ahead. This particular phenomenon, the subtle brightening that occurs before true sunrise in desert regions, had been noted by travelers and chroniclers for centuries, but few understood its tactical applications. The false dawn created a window of improved visibility without the harsh contrasts that would come with full daylight, allowing careful observers to spot details that remained hidden during both full darkness and the glaring hours after sunrise. Natural phenomena in the desert had been exploited by covert operators throughout history, though their techniques were rarely documented in official records. The false dawn offered particular advantages for reconnaissance work because it coincided with the period when most people were in their deepest sleep, guards were least alert, and the thermal currents that would later distort distant observations had not yet begun to rise from the warming sand. Chinese military treatises from this period contain oblique references to morning advantages that suggest systematic study of how natural light cycles could be incorporated into intelligence operations. The Caravan's movement during these pre-dawn hours followed patterns that seemed random to casual observation but actually reflected careful planning based on terrain analysis and astronomical calculations. Desert valleys that appeared identical during daylight revealed subtle differences in their acoustic properties during the still hours before sunrise. Some amplified sound in ways that made quiet movement impossible, while others seemed to absorb noise almost completely. The agents had learned to read these environmental signatures, using them to mask their passage while simultaneously gathering intelligence about the routes their targets might favor. The atmospheric conditions that created the false dawn also affected the behavior of desert wildlife in ways that experienced travelers could interpret. The brief period of improved visibility without thermal distortion allowed small animals to move more freely, creating patterns of activity that revealed the location of water sources, the passage of other travelers, and sometimes the presence of concealed settlements or camps. The Chinese agents observed these natural indicators with the same attention they devoted to human intelligence sources, understanding that the desert itself could provide information unavailable through conventional surveillance methods. How ancient spies used natural conditions to their advantage required understanding not just the immediate tactical benefits but the deeper patterns that governed life in harsh environments. Desert peoples had developed sophisticated knowledge systems that treated natural phenomena as sources of actionable intelligence. Wind patterns could indicate the approach of sandstorms days before they became visible on the horizon. Changes in the behavior of insects and small mammals often preceded human activity in areas that appeared completely uninhabited. The most successful intelligence operations in desert regions were those that learned to think like the desert itself, patient, observant, and attuned to subtle changes that revealed larger patterns. The trading post at Naya appeared unremarkable from any distance, a cluster of mud brick buildings around a modest well, with the usual collection of pack animals, storage areas, and merchant quarters that characterized oasis settlements throughout Central Asia. Afternoon light filtered through the narrow streets and covered courtyards in ways that created natural shadows for discreet conversations and concealed observations. But appearances in the intelligence world were almost always deceiving, and Naya represented something far more significant than its humble architecture suggested. A seemingly ordinary trading post could serve as an intelligence hub because of the fundamental nature of information flow along the Silk Road routes. Every merchant who stopped to water animals and resupply carried news from their point of origin and observations about conditions along their route. In the hands of skilled operators, this constant stream of commercial intelligence could be filtered, analyzed, and synthesized into strategic assessments that rival governments would pay handsomely to obtain. The challenge lay not in gathering information but in distinguishing valuable intelligence from the routine gossip and commercial rumors that filled every caravan stop. The operators at Naya had developed systems for processing information that would have impressed intelligence services in any era. Certain merchants were provided with particularly favorable trading terms in exchange for detailed reports about political conditions in distant cities. Others found that their most sensitive cargo received extra protection during dangerous portions of their journeys, creating incentives for sharing information about security threats and military movements. The most valuable intelligence sources were often unaware that they were providing anything more than routine commercial updates, making them nearly impossible for hostile services to identify and neutralize. The hidden world of Silk Road espionage operated through networks that spanned continents and persisted across generations. Family businesses that appeared to focus entirely on legitimate trade often maintained intelligence connections that had been established decades earlier and passed down through carefully selected successors. Religious institutions provided cover for information-gathering activities that could be disguised as missionary work or scholarly research. Even nomadic groups that seemed to exist entirely outside settled political structures often maintained intelligence relationships that provided them with early warning about military campaigns or policy changes that might affect their traditional grazing routes. The physical layout of Naya itself had been subtly modified to support intelligence operations without arousing suspicion. Certain buildings featured architectural details that seemed purely decorative but actually served as signal systems for communicating with distant observers. Storage areas were designed to accommodate concealment of sensitive materials or personnel, while still maintaining the appearance of routine commercial facilities. Most ingeniously, the settlement's water management system included channels that could carry written messages sealed in waterproof containers to pick-up points miles away, creating a communication network that operated independently of human couriers who might be intercepted or compromised. How many ordinary places concealed extraordinary secrets represented one of the fundamental challenges facing intelligence services throughout history. Every settlement along the major trade routes potentially housed operations that could affect the balance of power between distant empires. The most successful intelligence networks were those that learned to hide in plain sight, using the natural cover provided by legitimate commercial, religious, or administrative activities. Naya exemplified this approach, functioning simultaneously as a genuine trading post that provided real services to legitimate merchants and as a sophisticated intelligence collection and analysis center that supplied strategic information to Chinese decision-makers hundreds of miles away. The afternoon light in Naya's courtyards created natural gathering places where conversations could occur without seeming forced or artificial. Merchants naturally sought shade during the hottest parts of the day, creating opportunities for casual encounters that could yield valuable intelligence. The rhythm of daily life in the oasis provided cover for activities that might seem suspicious in other contexts: early morning departures that could mask the movement of couriers, evening gatherings that could serve as briefings or debriefings, and the constant arrival and departure of strangers that made it nearly impossible to maintain systematic surveillance of the facility. The ruins that emerged from the sand told stories that their builders never intended to preserve. Half-buried walls and collapsed roofs created an archaeological record of intelligence operations that had been concealed from contemporary observers but remained legible to those who understood how to read the physical evidence of covert activities. The golden hour light that slanted across these ancient structures revealed details that remained invisible during the harsh illumination of midday sun: subtle variations in construction techniques, hidden chambers that had been sealed and forgotten, and the remnants of communication systems that had once connected isolated outposts across vast distances. Archaeological evidence of intelligence networks required interpretation that went far beyond conventional historical analysis. Standard architectural features could serve dual purposes that became apparent only through careful examination of their positioning and construction details. Rooms that appeared to be simple storage areas might actually have been designed as secure meeting spaces, with acoustic properties that prevented eavesdropping and sight lines that allowed occupants to monitor approaches without being observed themselves. Decorative elements that seemed purely aesthetic often incorporated symbolic systems that conveyed information to initiated observers while remaining meaningless to casual visitors. The Chinese agents working through these buried sites understood that they were conducting a form of archaeological intelligence gathering that could yield insights unavailable through any other means. Written records of covert operations were rarely preserved, either because they were deliberately destroyed to protect operational security or because they were created using temporary materials and methods that left no permanent trace. But physical structures, especially those built to support sustained intelligence activities, incorporated design elements that revealed their true purposes to knowledgeable observers centuries after their abandonment. What stories these buried places still told required patience and expertise to decode. The positioning of buildings within the overall site plan often reflected security considerations that remain valid regardless of changes in political circumstances or military technology. Structures built to provide concealed observation of approaches to the settlement retained their strategic value even after the specific threats they were designed to counter had disappeared. Most significantly, the patterns of wear and modification visible in the ruins revealed how intelligence operations had adapted to changing conditions over periods of years or decades. The evidence preserved in these half-buried structures painted a picture of intelligence activities that were far more sophisticated and extensive than most historical accounts suggested. Hidden chambers contained the remnants of document storage systems that had protected sensitive materials from both human enemies and environmental threats. Concealed passages connected buildings in ways that allowed movement without exposure to observation from outside the compound. Communication systems incorporated both technological innovations and natural phenomena in ways that created redundant channels for maintaining contact with distant headquarters and field operations. The night market in Kasha operated according to rhythms that had been established centuries before any of its current participants were born. Oil lamps cast circles of warm light across carpets loaded with goods from across the known world, while shadows provided natural concealment for activities that required discretion. The great Western market centers had always served multiple functions simultaneously, as commercial hubs where legitimate trade generated enormous wealth, as cultural meeting points where different civilizations encountered and influenced each other, and as information exchanges where intelligence was valued alongside silk and spices. Information trading in these market environments required skills that combined commercial acumen with intelligence craft. The most valuable information was often embedded within routine commercial discussions, requiring buyers to understand not just what was being said explicitly but what could be inferred from patterns of trade, changes in pricing, and the presence or absence of particular merchants or goods. A sudden shortage of certain types of weapons might indicate military preparations in distant regions. Unusual demand for specific medicinal herbs could suggest the outbreak of diseases that might affect trade routes or military campaigns. Even changes in fashion preferences could reveal political developments in courts that influenced trade policies across vast regions. The physical layout of night markets created natural opportunities for covert communication and intelligence exchange. The maze-like arrangement of stalls and passages made systematic surveillance nearly impossible while providing numerous opportunities for brief, seemingly casual encounters between intelligence operatives and their sources. The constant movement of people, animals, and goods created background noise that could mask sensitive conversations, while the flickering light of oil lamps made positive identification of individuals difficult even for experienced observers. How intelligence was valued alongside silk and spices reflected the fundamental reality that information had become a commodity as important as any physical goods moving along the Silk Road routes. Merchants who could provide reliable intelligence about political conditions, military movements, or economic developments in distant regions found that such information commanded premium prices from buyers who understood its strategic value. The most successful traders were those who learned to gather, verify, and package intelligence as systematically as they handled more traditional merchandise. The night market environment also provided cover for more sophisticated intelligence operations that went far beyond simple information trading. Documents could be concealed within shipments of legitimate goods, allowing sensitive materials to travel across vast distances without arousing suspicion. Personnel could be moved through the same networks that transported commercial cargo, using the natural cover provided by merchant caravans and trading expeditions. Most importantly, the night markets served as recruitment centers where intelligence services could identify and develop sources among the merchants, craftsmen, and travelers who formed the human infrastructure of intercontinental trade. The conversations that occurred in the lamplight and shadows of Kasha's night market were shaping the balance of power across half the known world. Information gathered in these seemingly casual encounters would influence military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and commercial policies that affected millions of people across dozens of kingdoms and empires. The ancient game of espionage had found in the night markets of Central Asia a perfect environment for operations that combined commercial cover with strategic intelligence gathering, creating networks that would persist and evolve across centuries of political change and technological development. The morning mist clung to the desert floor like silk scarves forgotten by departing spirits, and in this ethereal light, the caravan that had crossed the Taklamakan's heart began its most delicate operation. Not the loading of ordinary goods, but the careful preparation of cargo that could shift the balance between empires. Each bundle wrapped in felt and leather contained more than silk or jade. Within these innocuous packages lay the architectural plans of fortress cities, detailed maps of water sources across enemy territories, and coded reports on the military capabilities of kingdoms whose names were whispered only in the councils of distant capitals. The merchant leader, whose weathered hands had guided countless legitimate trading expeditions, now supervised the placement of intelligence materials with the precision of a master craftsman. Every item had its designated position within the caravan's cargo, camouflaged among genuine trade goods in ways that would fool even experienced customs officials. The morning's work revealed the true artistry of ancient espionage, not dramatic midnight encounters or theatrical disguises, but the methodical craft of hiding world-changing information within the mundane rhythms of commercial transport. As the sun climbed higher and began to burn away the protective mist, the caravan's members understood that they carried more than their own lives in their hands. The intelligence they transported represented months of careful cultivation, patient observation, and calculated risk-taking by operatives whose names would never appear in any official records. These anonymous agents had traded their safety for information that could prevent wars or start them, information that could save cities from siege or doom them to conquest. The return journey across the Taklamakan demanded different skills than the outward passage. Now they moved not as explorers seeking knowledge, but as guardians protecting secrets that multiple empires would kill to obtain. The psychological weight of this responsibility changed how they read the desert's moods, how they interpreted the behavior of other travelers they encountered, and how they balanced the competing demands of speed and stealth that governed their progress through the shifting landscape of sand and stone. The caravan's pace reflected this new dynamic, fast enough to minimize exposure to the desert's dangers and to potential interceptors, but controlled enough to avoid the kind of hurried movement that might attract unwanted attention from other travelers or the scattered watchtowers that various kingdoms maintained along the more traveled routes. They moved like experienced hunters who understood that survival often depended more on patience and careful observation than on speed or aggression. The desert itself seemed to sense the change in their mission. Where the outward journey had felt like a conversation with an ancient and mysterious landscape, the return passage carried an undercurrent of tension that made every wind shift feel like a potential threat, every distant dust cloud like a possible pursuit. The Taklamakan had witnessed countless such journeys over the centuries, caravans bearing secrets that would reshape the political landscape of Central Asia, intelligence that would influence the rise and fall of dynasties whose names would echo through history. 3 days into the return journey, the western horizon began to darken with the distinctive color that experienced desert travelers recognized as the approaching signature of a major sandstorm. Not the brief, localized dust devils that could be weathered in the open, but one of the massive atmospheric disturbances that could bury entire caravans and reshape the desert's geography in a matter of hours. The storm's approach forced a decision that would test both the mission's timeline and the crew's survival skills. The natural rock shelter they located appeared like a gift from the desert gods, a deep cave system carved into a limestone outcropping that rose from the sand like the spine of some buried giant. The shelter offered protection not just from the approaching storm, but from the kind of observation that made caravans vulnerable to both natural predators and human threats. As they guided their camels into the cave's mouth and began the careful process of securing both animals and cargo, the first winds of the approaching sandstorm began to test the desert's surface with exploratory gusts that sent small tornadoes of sand dancing across the landscape. Inside the shelter, as the storm's full force began to assault the world outside, the caravan members settled into the particular rhythm that ancient travelers developed for weathering extended periods of enforced stillness. The cave became a temporary world unto itself, lit by carefully shielded oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls that bore the marks of countless previous occupants, scratched names in languages both familiar and forgotten, drawings of animals and symbols that spoke of the universal human need to leave traces of passage through dangerous places. The storm's voice outside the cave rose and fell like a conversation in some elemental language, punctuated by the percussion of sand against rock and the deeper bass notes of wind finding resonance in the cave system's hidden chambers. This natural symphony provided perfect acoustic cover for the quiet conversations that intelligence work required, discussions of routes and timing, assessments of risks and opportunities, and the careful review of procedures that would govern the transfer of their precious cargo to the next link in the intelligence chain. The patience required for this kind of work, waiting out natural dangers while protecting information that could influence the fate of empires, represented one of the most challenging aspects of ancient espionage. Modern intelligence operations could rely on rapid communication and technological solutions to problems of timing and coordination. Ancient operatives had to develop an almost meditative ability to balance urgency with survival, to maintain focus on long-term objectives while managing immediate threats to life and mission. As the hours passed and the storm continued its assault on the world beyond their shelter, the caravan members took turns monitoring their animals, checking the security of their cargo, and maintaining the vigilance that survival in hostile territory demanded. The enforced stillness created space for the kind of reflection that rarely found room in the active phases of intelligence work, consideration of the human cost of the information they carried, awareness of the families and communities whose lives might be changed by the intelligence reports hidden among their trade goods. The storm finally exhausted itself just before dawn, leaving behind a transformed landscape where familiar landmarks had been buried or relocated by the wind's sculptural work. The desert's new configuration required careful navigation to avoid areas where the sand had been churned into unstable formations that could trap unwary travelers. The morning's travel became an exercise in reading the subtle signs that revealed whether solid footing could be found among the storm's sandy reconstructions. The intelligence materials had weathered the storm without damage, protected by the multiple layers of wrapping and concealment that represented generations of accumulated expertise in safeguarding sensitive information during long-distance transport. Each bundle remained secure in its designated position within the caravan's cargo, ready for the final phase of a journey that had already tested every aspect of the team's professional capabilities. As they approached the hidden valley near Dunhuang where the transfer would take place, the mission entered its most delicate phase. The handoff of intelligence materials required coordination with operatives whose identities remained unknown to the transport team, timing that depended on signals and recognition codes that had been established months earlier, and security procedures designed to protect both the information and the people who handled it from potential compromise. The valley itself had been chosen for its natural concealment and its position along established trade routes that would allow both parties to approach and depart without attracting attention from other travelers or local authorities. Hidden among the rocky formations that dotted this transitional zone between pure desert and the agricultural lands around Dunhuang, the transfer site offered the combination of security and accessibility that intelligence operations required. The evening light cast long shadows across the valley floor as the caravan descended toward the predetermined meeting point. The operatives who emerged from concealment among the rocks moved with the confident efficiency of professionals who had conducted such transfers many times before. Their appearance, travel-stained robes, pack animals loaded with legitimate trade goods, the weathered faces of men who spent their lives moving between distant cities, provided perfect camouflage for their true function as links in an intelligence network that spanned continents. The transfer itself followed protocols that balanced security with speed. Each intelligence package was examined to verify its integrity, checked against coded inventories that confirmed the completeness of the material being transferred, and then integrated into the new transport team's cargo with the same careful attention to concealment that had protected it during the desert crossing. The entire process took place in near silence, with hand signals and whispered confirmations replacing the kind of detailed discussion that might compromise operational security. As the new team prepared to depart with their precious cargo, the original caravan members experienced the particular satisfaction that came with the successful completion of a mission that had tested every aspect of their professional capabilities. They had crossed one of the world's most dangerous deserts, protected intelligence materials worth more than their combined weight in gold, and delivered their cargo to the next link in a chain that would carry these secrets to the councils of distant empires. The final approach to Dunhuang took place in the early morning light that painted the city's walls in shades of gold and amber. The ancient city rose from the desert like a mirage made permanent, its gates and towers representing not just physical security but the return to a world where their dangerous mission could be acknowledged only in the most indirect ways. The guards who examined their legitimate trade goods and processed their entry documents had no knowledge of the intelligence operation that had just concluded successfully in the valley beyond the city's site. The merchant leader who had guided the mission through all its phases now resumed his cover identity with the seamless transition that marked true professional competence. His conversations with customs officials, his negotiations with local traders, and his arrangements for the care and feeding of his animals all proceeded with the same attention to detail that had characterized the intelligence operation, but now directed toward maintaining the commercial facade that made such missions possible. The streets of Dunhuang welcomed them back into the world of ordinary commerce and legitimate trade, but the knowledge of what they had accomplished remained carefully compartmented within the small group who had shared the dangers and responsibilities of the desert crossing. They had participated in the kind of intelligence operation that rarely found its way into historical records, the kind of mission that influenced the course of history through information rather than warfare, through patience and careful planning rather than dramatic action. As the sun climbed higher and the city awakened to another day of trade and travel, the former members of the spy caravan dispersed into the anonymous flow of merchants, craftsmen, and travelers that gave Central Asian cities their distinctive character. Some would remain in Dunhuang for extended periods, establishing the kind of commercial relationships that provided cover for future intelligence operations. Others would join different caravans heading toward distant destinations, carrying with them the experience and expertise that would make them valuable assets for whatever missions the future might require. The Taklamakan desert stretched away beyond the city's walls, its vast expanse already beginning to erase the traces of their passage with the patient work of wind and sand that had been reshaping this landscape for millions of years. The ancient desert had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, the passage of armies and merchants, explorers, and refugees, but it maintained its secrets with the same discretion that marked successful intelligence operations. In the growing heat of the morning, as the last shadows of dawn retreated toward the bases of the surrounding mountains, the desert resumed its eternal dialogue with the sky, a conversation conducted in the language of shifting sand and changing light that had been continuing since long before humans learned to read meaning in the movement of caravans across the horizon. The spy caravan that had crossed the Taklamakan's heart had become part of this ancient story, another thread in the complex tapestry of human ambition and survival that the desert had been weaving for millennia. The intelligence they had transported would influence decisions made in capitals whose names were already fading from the active vocabulary of international diplomacy, would affect the outcomes of conflicts whose causes were rooted in the complex web of trade relationships and territorial ambitions that characterized the ancient world. The success of their mission represented a victory for the patient, methodical approach to intelligence gathering that understood information as a strategic resource more valuable than armies or treasure. The empty desert held its counsel as the day progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, offering no commentary on the human dramas that played out across its surface, no judgment on the ambitions and fears that drove men to risk their lives carrying secrets through landscapes that tested the limits of human endurance. The Taklamakan remained what it had always been, a vast stage for human courage and folly, a testing ground where survival depended on the ability to read correctly the subtle signs that distinguished safety from danger, truth from deception, success from catastrophe. The wind that rose with the setting sun carried with it the whispered echoes of all the journeys that had crossed this ancient landscape, the footsteps of explorers and merchants, the hoofbeats of cavalry and pack animals, the quiet passage of those who moved through the night carrying information that could reshape the balance of power across half the known world. In the desert's memory, the spy caravan that had just completed its mission joined the endless procession of human ambition and determination that had been crossing these sands since the first traders discovered that the shortest route between distant civilizations led directly through the heart of one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. The amber light of oil lamps flickered across bamboo strips as scribes worked through the late hours in oases that existed as mere dots on the vast expanse of desert maps. Their brushes moved with practiced precision, recording not just the passage of caravans but the subtle details that transformed routine trade documentation into intelligence archives. The weight of a merchant's pack, the condition of his animals, the languages overheard around evening fires, each observation found its way into the careful characters that filled these administrative records, creating a web of information that stretched across the known world. In the settlement of Naya, where the spy caravan had made its final rendezvous, the keeper of records maintained ledgers that appeared to document nothing more significant than water rights and grazing fees. Yet embedded within these mundane entries lay a sophisticated system for tracking the movement of information across the Silk Road network. A notation about excessive water usage might indicate the passage of a larger group than officially reported. An entry recording damaged equipment could signal the need for urgent message transmission. The bureaucratic language of Oasis administration concealed a vocabulary of espionage that had evolved over generations of careful practice. The bamboo message slips themselves represented centuries of refinement in the art of covert communication. Each strip was prepared according to precise specifications, the quality of bamboo indicating the urgency of the message, the method of binding revealing the intended recipient, the pattern of wax seals serving as authentication that could not be easily forged. The scribes who prepared these documents understood that their work would survive journeys that claimed the lives of the messengers who carried them, and they invested each character with the weight of imperial authority and the precision required for decisions that would affect the security of distant frontiers. The water accounting systems that governed Oasis life provided perfect cover for intelligence operations because survival in the desert demanded meticulous record-keeping that no one questioned. Every jar filled, every animal watered, every irrigation channel maintained, these activities generated documentation that could easily accommodate additional layers of meaning. A record of water distribution to a merchant caravan might include details about the cargo manifest that revealed strategic materials being transported to potential enemies. An inventory of storage containers could indicate the capacity for supporting military operations in regions far from traditional supply lines. The handoffs of intelligence materials occurred in the spaces between official activities, during the quiet moments when the business of maintaining desert settlements created natural opportunities for private conversation. A water bearer delivering supplies to a merchant camp might exchange more than pleasantries about well conditions. A stable keeper checking on animals could transfer documents concealed in feed sacks or tucked into the leatherwork of saddles and bridles. These exchanges required perfect timing and absolute discretion, skills that developed over years of practice in environments where the slightest mistake could compromise networks that had taken decades to establish. The transformation of individual observations into strategic intelligence happened through the patient work of analysts who understood how to read patterns across vast geographical and temporal scales. A report of unusual activity at a mountain pass, combined with accounts of increased horse trading in a distant market, might reveal the preparation for military campaigns that would not become apparent through conventional diplomatic channels for months or years. The intelligence networks of the Han dynasty operated on the principle that information gained its value not through dramatic revelations but through the accumulation of small details that, when properly interpreted, revealed the intentions and capabilities of potential adversaries. The routes that appeared on the maps carried by these spy caravans represented far more than geographical knowledge. They encoded the accumulated wisdom of generations of travelers who had learned to read the desert's moods and seasons, who understood which water sources remained reliable during drought years and which passes stayed open when winter snows blocked traditional routes. This cartographic intelligence constituted a strategic advantage that could determine the success or failure of military campaigns, the profitability of trading ventures, and the survival of diplomatic missions sent to negotiate with the constantly shifting alliances of Central Asian kingdoms. The preservation of these routes required constant maintenance through networks of informants who monitored changes in political control, environmental conditions, and the activities of competing intelligence services. A new fortification built to control a strategic pass, a shift in tribal allegiances that made previously safe territories dangerous, a drought that eliminated water sources essential for long-distance travel. Such changes needed to be incorporated into the intelligence databases maintained in oasis archives and transmitted to operational planners in the imperial capital through the same covert channels that carried reports on military preparations and diplomatic negotiations. The spy caravan that had successfully crossed the Taklamakan represented just one thread in a web of intelligence gathering that extended across the entire Silk Road network. Similar operations were being conducted simultaneously in other directions, following different routes and pursuing complementary objectives, all coordinated through communication systems that allowed for the integration of intelligence from sources separated by thousands of miles and months of travel time. The success of these operations depended not just on the courage of individual agents but on the maintenance of infrastructure that made such coordination possible across the vast distances and challenging terrain that characterized the ancient world's most important trade networks. The documentation generated by these intelligence operations accumulated in archives that served multiple purposes within the imperial administrative system. The same records that preserved strategic intelligence about foreign territories and potential military threats also contained valuable information about trade opportunities, technological innovations, and cultural developments that could benefit the empire through peaceful exchange. This dual nature of Silk Road intelligence reflected the complex relationship between commerce and statecraft in an era when economic and military power remained inseparably linked, and when information about distant markets could prove as valuable as knowledge of enemy troop movements. The training required to operate effectively within these intelligence networks demanded years of preparation that went far beyond the obvious skills of desert survival and covert communication. Agents needed to develop expertise in the languages, customs, and commercial practices of the regions where they would operate, along with the ability to maintain cover identities that would withstand scrutiny from suspicious local authorities. They studied the genealogies of ruling families, the religious practices that shaped daily life in different communities, the seasonal patterns that governed agricultural production and trade cycles, and the subtle social indicators that could reveal political tensions before they erupted into open conflict. The psychological demands of intelligence work in such environments tested human endurance in ways that went beyond the physical challenges of desert travel. Agents spent months or years maintaining false identities while gathering information that they could not immediately transmit to their superiors, living with the constant awareness that discovery could mean not just personal death but the compromise of networks that supported dozens of other operations. The mental discipline required to function effectively under such conditions represented a form of training that prepared individuals for the unique stresses of long-term covert operations in hostile territory. The legacy of these ancient intelligence networks extended far beyond their immediate military and diplomatic applications. The information they gathered contributed to the development of geographical knowledge that would influence trade route selection for centuries, while the communication systems they established created precedents for information management that would be adapted and refined by successive dynasties. The administrative techniques developed to conceal intelligence operations within routine bureaucratic functions provided models for covert activities that would be employed by intelligence services throughout history, demonstrating the enduring value of approaches that prioritized patience and systematic observation over dramatic action. The desert itself served as both obstacle and ally in these operations, its harsh conditions providing natural security for covert activities while demanding the highest levels of skill and preparation from those who attempted to traverse its expanse. The Taklamakan's reputation as a place where caravans disappeared without trace created an environment where unusual disappearances or altered travel schedules aroused little suspicion, while its vast distances and difficult terrain made pursuit or surveillance by hostile forces extremely challenging. Intelligence operatives learned to work with the desert's natural rhythms, timing their movements to coincide with seasonal weather patterns and using the landscape's features to conceal their activities from observation. The water sources that made desert crossing possible also served as natural gathering points where intelligence could be collected and transmitted. Oases functioned as information hubs where travelers from different regions shared news about conditions along various routes, political developments in distant kingdoms, and opportunities for profitable trade relationships. Intelligence operatives learned to position themselves within these informal information networks, contributing enough genuine commercial intelligence to establish their credibility while gathering the strategic information that justified their dangerous journeys across the desert's trackless expanse. As the centuries passed and the political landscape of Central Asia shifted through conquest and cultural change, the intelligence techniques developed by these ancient spy networks would adapt to new circumstances while maintaining their fundamental principles of patient observation, careful documentation, and systematic analysis. The bamboo strips and wax seals would give way to different technologies, but the basic challenge of gathering reliable information across vast distances in hostile territory would remain constant, ensuring that the lessons learned in the Taklamakan shifting sands would continue to influence intelligence operations throughout the ancient world and beyond. The success of operations like the spy caravan that crossed the desert at night demonstrated that information could indeed prove more valuable than armies or treasure, but only when gathered through networks that understood intelligence as a strategic resource requiring the same careful cultivation and protection as any other form of imperial power. In the quiet archives of oasis settlements, where scribes continued their work long after the caravans had departed, the patient accumulation of knowledge continued, adding each small observation to the vast store of information that would shape the decisions of emperors and the fate of kingdoms across half the known world. The ancient travelers who established these intelligence networks understood that their work served purposes that extended far beyond immediate military or diplomatic objectives, contributing to a body of knowledge about the world's geography, cultures, and resources that would benefit future generations of explorers, merchants, and scholars. Their legacy reminds us that the most significant journeys in human history often leave the fewest traces, carried out by individuals whose names were deliberately forgotten but whose contributions shaped the course of civilizations in ways that continue to influence our understanding of how information moves across boundaries of culture, language, and political control. Tomorrow's journey will follow different travelers along ancient paths, perhaps those who carried not secrets but stories, whose caravans bore not intelligent reports but the accumulated wisdom of distant libraries, crossing deserts not to serve imperial ambitions but to preserve knowledge that might otherwise vanish with the civilizations that created it.